in about 30 seconds.
It's okay. I can wait. And by the way, this article is too difficult to understand.
Uh-huh. Okay, so I have to do it. I'm doing it step by step, and hopefully talking about each necessary step.
Even though I put the article on the computer to translate it to Chinese, but I can't. It in Chinese, I can't understand it, and I think it's too deep.
Yeah, it may be pretty deep. We're talking about depth psychology here, so and a lot of the concepts that are contained here relate to Christianity, and so I'll try to explain them quite simply. And if you have questions, please do ask them. My intention is to go very slowly and to try to help people who are brand new to this follow what the points are, what the major points are, and hopefully it will be helpful. And so I'll just wait a little bit longer.
Okay.
Well, or here we go. I'll begin. Okay, so last week we were talking maybe I should begin. Okay, my text today is Carl Jung, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions, by Murray Stein and Thomas Arzt. And Dr. Arzt was a mentor of mine who unfortunately died on April the 12th, I believe, because of COVID. And so my reading of this essay is in part a memoriam to him, and it will be on YouTube. But I wanted to do it at this time to make it available across the world. And so last week in part 2, we were discussing this this philosophical comment that Heidegger made, that he says a secret life holds sway in the unconscious. Now, what he's talking about here is what Dr. Jung would have called the 2-million-year-old man. So in other words, it's each one of us as human beings, we all have basically the same origins, and those origins have stayed the same over millions of years. And so one of the basic concepts in Jungian psychology is the idea of individuation. Now, what that means is that you can think of it by this metaphor. A tree, an oak tree or any kind of tree, is like every other tree of that species. So, for example, an oak tree has some characteristics like every other oak tree. And so it can be identified by those characteristics. But at the same time, every tree is different. And so there are no two oak trees alike. So in the same sense, in the human species, we're all human beings, and so we all have certain characteristics which are the same, but we each one of us is slightly different. We have different DNA. The histories of our families over probably millions of years diverged and went to different places on the earth, faced different challenges, and so on. And so we're all also different. And that's true of every species. And so what Dr. Jung was saying about individuation is that it is the tendency of your unconscious mind to make the specific you, to create you. And that makes you a unique individual. And so that process is driven by forces that we don't think about. They're unconscious forces, but they are within the psyche. And so that's why Heidegger, he was referring back to Heidegger, who said this secret life holds sway in the unconscious. So that secret life is creating each one of us. That's the point. And let's see.
I'm sorry, teacher. I didn't catch up with you. Which page we still on? The 19 or the 20?
I'm just at the bottom of page 20. Okay, or page 19. I'm sorry, page 19. I'm going to begin. I'm now going to begin on the first full paragraph on page 19. Or I'm sorry, I'm going to begin on the last paragraph on page 19, which is after the Heidegger quote. Okay.
The paragraph is started with the spirit is waiting in the collective, right?
Right. Okay, so I'm going to explain this sentence by sentence, right? And also, let me just mention that last week we were talking about the need for some creative activity. In other words, that we all need to do something creative, because that is what allows us to connect with our soul and to understand what we as individual people should be doing. And so I normally give an example about creativity, that it's a way to connect to this deep part of the unconscious, this so-called 2 million year old man. It's actually, in Jung's time, it might have been 2 million years. Today, we know it to be 3.5 billion years old, which, because each of us has ancestors, millions of ancestors, who go back to single-celled organisms. In other words, from the beginning of life to ours, there's been a continuous chain of ancestors who have done two things successfully. They have survived. They survived until they reproduced. Okay. And so every ancestor in our lineage, every one of us, goes back to single-celled organisms, and every one of those ancestors for every living human being did two things successfully. They survived until they reproduced. So, we all are descended. Every human being is descended from those successful ancestors, and that applies to any living being as well, right? And so, in order to understand what we individually are intended to be, we need some creative activity that tells our soul is this deepest foundation within ourselves, tells our soul how to, what to do, okay? And so, for example, every morning I make an omelet for my wife for breakfast. And that's a creative activity. It's not terribly creative, but it causes me to take some ingredients and put them together in a certain way and then serve a meal to my wife. And what that activity does for me is it connects me first thing in the morning with my soul, with my unconscious. Now, you can do it anyway. You don't have to be a cook or a chef. In my country, we might have different interests. So we might be interested in woodworking, making a piece of furniture with wood, or we might be interested in art, painting or sculpture. We might be interested in dance or cooking, let's say. And so in order to find out what's calling us, what our soul wants, we can have a rough idea. Okay, I want to go to the store that sells tools if I'm interested in woodworking, or I want to go to the store that sells art supplies, or I want to go to the store that sells cooking supplies. Okay, so you're in the general right area of the type of thing you want to use for your creativity. Then simply go into that shop and walk up and down the aisles and see what calls you, what interests you. It could be paintbrushes and paints, different kinds of paints, watercolor or oils, for example. It could be, if you're into woodworking, it could be a large saw of some sort. If you are into cooking, it might be a certain kind of pot. For example, I don't have one, but for my omelet habit, I could buy a special pan that's especially purposed for that kind of food preparation, which is making an omelet. Okay, you take that home and you start to work with it, and gradually your unconscious is going to tell you what it wants you to do with it, and how to be with it. For example, I thought at one point that I wanted to do calligraphy, and so I started to so I bought the equipment, I bought special pens for it, I bought paper and so on, and then I just started to do it. And at the beginning, it was very bad. And mind you, none of this has to be for sale, okay? Let me put the chat up here. None of this has to be for sale. In other words, this is a personal practice that you're going to use to be in contact with your unconscious. And so it doesn't have to be beautiful that would be sold in a shop or put in a museum. It's just your way of communicating with your deep unconscious. And so we all need that, because we need a connection to that 2 million-year-old man, in addition, or woman, in addition to the conscious ego person that we think we are. And we need a connection between the two, which we call spirit. Okay, so the spirit is the communications between the soul, which is your foundation, and your everyday life. And if you have that connection, it will be very good for you because it will tell you things. And it tells you things in very many different ways. It can tell you things by bad feelings that you have, by depression even. It can tell you, for me, sometimes it gives me a vision. For example, if I'm coming to police activity, which I haven't noticed yet, my self, my deep unconscious, tells me that there's police activity in the area by showing me an image of a police car. When I see that image, I always know that I'm going to see police activity very soon, within a minute or two. And it always happens. So my psyche in my imagination shows me that image, not physically. It's not in the physical world. It's only in my imagination. But when I see that image in my imagination, when it comes to mind, then I pay attention. And if I'm driving fast, I slow down. And because that's my psyche telling me there's going to be police activity quite soon. And so that's why we have to have connection, creative connection with the soul. Okay, so now reading on here. So I'm at the beginning of, or at the end of page 19, and the next sentence is, the spirit is waiting in the collective unconscious for recognition, for integration into the collective consciousness of our postmodern times. So everything in the world has spirit in it, and we don't see that spirit. But if we think about atoms, we know that atoms have neutrons and electrons and protons sometimes, but especially neutrons and electrons. So we know that they're active and they have a certain consciousness. For example, all large masses attract one another. That's gravity. And so, for example, in the early universe, there was just a lot of dust out there. But over billions of years, those particles of dust were conscious enough to pull themselves together and form planets. And if they pulled in enough mass, they would create a star and they would start to burn. And if they sucked in even more mass still, they could create a black hole, which would start attracting mass from everywhere. So in our galaxy, we are part of the Milky Way galaxy, which is quite huge. It's 100,000 light years across, and it has billions of stars and planets in it. But it's all held together. We're all orbiting over many years. We're all orbiting this black hole that's at the center of the universe, that's very far from Earth. It's, I think the number is something like 26,000 light years from the center of the universe. But everything in the universe is attracted to that. So every molecule in the universe is attracted to every other molecule in the universe in a certain way. And some parts were not were more dense and some less, and so it formed what we today see as stars and galaxies. And so that kind of spirit, and that's sort of one kind of spirit, is waiting in the collective unconscious. In other words, it's the unconscious of not only everything, but also our societies and so on, for recognition. And all that spirit has evolved in different ways. So, for example, the United States has people coming from all over the world. So there's something about the United States that is attractive to people everywhere in the world. That's a kind of spirit. And people may have different reasons because we're quite complex creatures now. But from every country in the world, every race, every ethnic group, every language speaking people, every one of them has people that want to come to the United States. And that's a kind of gravity, it's a spirit. And so, and you know, that it can be something different. For example, it could be this class, for example, there's something that caused you to want to be here listening to this class today. And so there's a spirit in that. It's a collective spirit because there are several of us that are involved in this discussion. And we all want to be here together to talk about this topic. That's a spirit, that's a collective spirit that's pulling us together. Okay, and so that spirit wants to be integrated into the collective consciousness. So we want it, so maybe we don't know why we're listening to this discussion right now. We may not consciously know, but the unconscious wants to become conscious. So, for example, going back to the individuation issue, an oak tree wants to become an oak tree, and it has, when it's an acorn, when it's only the seed of an oak tree, it already has within it that spirit, which is going to become this huge tree. And that spirit will work through the assets available to it until it manifests that huge tree. So in this case, where we have a few people on YouTube and a few people on the Zoom chat, we don't know exactly why we're here yet, but if we keep interacting, that spirit will gradually manifest and show us why we're doing this. And so this is what this sentence is talking about. So I'll just read it again because it's an important idea. The spirit is waiting in the collective unconscious for recognition, for integration into the collective consciousness of our postmodern times. Now, Dr. Arzt was talking about postmodern times being a time where everything has been, it's like shaking the dice and throwing them out on the table. Everything has been thrown up in the air, and it's hard to see structure sometimes. I mean, when people watch American news channels, what they see often is debate. We're often debating with one another, and sometimes very loudly, sometimes very profanely, and so people who are outside the U.S. don't understand how we can live that way, because those people live in a country that might be more rigid in its structure. And so debate isn't even allowed. And so, you know, what works best? Well, over time, over now 400 years that this country has been developing in this way, what happens is the best ideas of everyone get absorbed into the society. They get integrated into the society. But the worst ideas get rejected by everyone. And that process is a process like tempering steel. So you could think of a Japanese swordsmith, somebody who's making a sword, which the Japanese call a katana. And Japanese katanas are known to be the hardest steel. And that's because somebody is at a forge or was at a forge when they were making these by hand. And they were heating it up and pounding it to get the impurities out of the iron. And the result was that they made it stronger and stronger. And so this would happen maybe 900 or 1,000 times. In other words, they're at the forge, they're making their steel, and it's bang, 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 then bang, 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 bang with the hammer. And each time the hammer hits the iron, it becomes harder and gets the impurities out. And so that's the process that has created the United States in very big ways, because we accept all the good ideas, we accept the iron, but we push all the impurities out. And so so the postmodern times, though, are times when we used to have, for example, very clear borders in Europe. You know, it was easy to tell where all the Germans were, where all the Italians were, and so on. But now the European Union has joined together, and so the borders aren't as clear as they once were. And it will take them a long time to become as mixed as the United States became, by the special example of our location on the planet. We had people coming from everywhere into an entirely new environment. So there wasn't anybody that was fixed there already. But we're starting to mix together. And so what we're having to do in the world is we're having to bring into consciousness what we can receive from other places and pick the best things for our society and reject the others. And the best things we have to try to integrate into our society, into our lives, and so on. And so if you understand that process, then you understand why a country that's always in debate is developing faster than a country that doesn't allow debate, for example. Okay. So I hope, so we've gotten through one sentence. Okay, next sentence. Today the spirit is knocking at our door, or as Junger put it, the primordial essence is alive. So this is basically the point that I've been making throughout this so far, which is that our essence, the essence of what it means to be a human being, is trying to manifest itself. And we don't know what that essence ultimately is, because we all have impurities. We have impure thoughts of all kinds. And, you know,
Teacher,
sure.
I didn't catch up with paragraph with line we are reading.
Is like what?
Oh,
So I'm on the very last line on page 19.
Oh, very last. Oh, very last. Okay, thank you.
All right, so in the very last line of page 19, it says the primordial essence is alive. Okay, and so what I'm saying is that this is an essence within every creature. Every living creature has a primordial essence, whether it's a plant or an animal, and that essence is trying to manifest all the time. It's trying to get out into our conscious lives. Okay, it's unconscious, but then it manifests. So, for example, a seed of a rose, let's say. You have a seed of a beautiful flower, a rose or a lotus. That seed has a primordial essence for that flower, okay, in it already. It's there already. And then when it has a proper environment, it manifests itself as a rose over time. It puts up shoots of green, and then it gradually builds a bud, and that bud gradually opens, and so on. And so it goes from a seed to a flower. Well, everything is like that. All beings are like that. So this primordial essence is what we're talking about here, that the spirit within this primordial essence is trying to push its way up and manifest itself. So now what we have, what postmodern means, is that suddenly we're beyond having very clear boundaries on lots of things, not only on countries, but on technologies and everything. And so, and on religious ideas and so on. All those things are used to be very well contained, okay? And so it used to be true that every religion was very clear, okay? Every religion was very clear, and everybody knew if you were a Christian that you were a Catholic. Up until 500 years ago, everybody was a Catholic and only one kind of Catholic. But in the second decade of the 16th century, 1517 or something like that, Martin Luther said, well, that container of the Catholic Church doesn't work for me anymore, because the priests and the Pope are cheating. They're not looking to God anymore. They're looking for ways to earn money. And so they were selling indulgences, which meant that they were selling the grace of God, which they didn't really have. They didn't really have that, but because it was invisible, the people who were relatively ignorant at that time didn't know that. They thought the priests were working for God, and that God could issue grace based on these sales. So they would put money into the church, and therefore God would be kind to them. Well, Martin Luther says, no, come on, that's not right. And so, because the point was God gives grace freely, he doesn't charge. And so the church split into those who believed one way and those who believed another. And so now, 500 years later, we have something like 400 Protestant churches, because each one of them split in some way over the years. And there are 5 Catholic churches, so they all split. Okay, so now something that was very solid in 1500 and 500 years ago, something which was very solid and clear. Everybody knew what a Christian was. Now it's not so clear. And so something new has to evolve. Something new has to allow to come together. And that's a spirit. And so today with, for example, the internet, we can all look at every religion. And Dr. Jung's position was that all religions basically are accomplishing the same thing, and that they're all basically they are grand methods of psychotherapy. And in fact, let me just give you that quote, because there's a good meme on this. I should have brought it up because I often use it, but I know right where it is. So let me pull it up and share it for you. Okay, so I'm going to share the quote here. Okay, so theologians and psychologists are in the same business. For thousands of years, the mind of man was worried about the sick soul, perhaps even earlier than it did about the sick body. The propitiation of gods, the perils of the soul, and its salvation. These are not yesterday's problems. Religions are naturally evolved psychotherapeutic systems in the truest sense of the word and on the grandest scale. They express the whole range of the psychic problem in mighty images. They are the avowal and recognition of the soul, and at the same time, the revelation of the soul's nature. Now, the point about that is that now, up until 1500, everybody was very clear about what this religion believed and how it was doing it and what the rules were and what you were supposed to do if you followed that religion. But now that we have the internet, where ideas flow across the world relatively freely, now we can look at the other religions and we can say, they know something that we didn't know. And they have a better way of thinking of that. So maybe we ought to adopt that. So that's postmodernism, which is now everybody in the world who is connected to the internet is looking at more or less everyone else in the world, and we're all trying to decide what are the best ideas for living going forward. And so there's an essence within us, this primordial essence is alive, that's saying, okay, well, I'm awake now, and now I'm looking at other countries and trying to understand what they do that works better than what we do. And so that's causing all kinds of disruption in our politics and just our way of thinking. So I hope that's relatively clear. We've managed to get through 2 sentences. So there's a lot packed into this essay. There's no doubt about that. Okay, so let me read the next sentence. Many pathologies of our age emerge from the lack of having an alchemist vessel to integrate these archetypal spiritual energies into the socio-cultural context. So what this means is that we have to have a container in which we can bring new ideas and then evolve them so that they work for us. So those that alchemical vessel could be anything. It could be a religion, it could be a nation state, it could be your own family. Okay, so your own family, if you have a mother and father and 3 children, for example, that's an alchemist vessel. That's a container. And so you decide what can and should be integrated. So for example, if there's a teenager who wants to play loud music, and so they get the idea, the spirit tells that teenager that what the spirit wants, what the soul wants is loud music, then there's going to be a conflict between the teenager and the parents, let's say, where the parents can say, okay, well, you can play music, but use your headset so that we don't all have to listen to it, right? Well, it's that kind of dislocation that's happening on this enormous 7.5 billion human being scale right now. And so it's happening in the family, it's happening in your schools, it's happening in religions, it's happening in every city, county, country, political designation. And so the fact that these vessels now have broken down, so is causing a problem, and something new has to be created. So for example, in the United States, we worry about the loss of the nuclear family, the typical family of father, mother, and children, because half of our marriages here end in divorce. Well, so that's a breakdown of this family container, and so there's no structure in which you can live. And just a minute. There's no structure in which you can live. And so you have to develop a way of living that's new, and that's happening across the world right now. So because we have the internet, we have so many new ideas that are coming into families, into religions, into countries, that there's an incredible churn going on. And that's what postmodernism is. So so the lack of having that vessel is the lack of having something in which you can integrate and bring these ideas. I mean, without a vessel, you can go out in a field and you can start talking to the birds, but it's not going to mean very much in human life, and so if you get the idea, okay, I just want to talk to the animals. I hate human beings, so I'm not going to talk to human beings. I'm going to go out in the field. Well, that's all well and good for you, but it's not going to change society much if you do that. But if, on the other hand, you get a new idea from, let's say, this YouTube live stream, then you can go and bring that into your family and change everybody's perspectives a little bit. So I had a mentor once who said, every time I bring someone new into the company, it changes the company. Why? Because that new person brings new ideas. And every time I take someone away from the company, also it changes the company. And so that is this idea that, you know, we all live in certain alchemical vessels. We all live in these psychic structures, and it depends on what we're talking about. So we all have a family, and there's certain things that are appropriate to bring into the family and certain things that are not. The same is true of a religion. I mean, if you have a very traditional dour religion, very severe, and someone comes in and wants to play rock music in the place of worship, that may be spiritual for them, and it may have something to do with their religion, but it's not appropriate in the traditional place of worship of that religion. And so that's the stress that we're all feeling, because so many of our traditional ways of looking at the world have changed, and they've changed very dramatically, and we have to integrate that. So, for example, when I was on active duty in the Marine Corps 50 years ago, 50 years ago, I studied the Chinese language. And at that time, I studied the Chinese language so that I could better fight a war against China. But because of the way things have changed and developed over the last 50 years, now I have my interest in China, and I would want to interact with the Chinese, not with guns, but with ideas. And so those are the kinds of changes that we as human beings are going through, and it's happening on a global basis. All 7.5 billion of us are facing those kinds of changes all the time. So I can tell a small joke to my Chinese listeners, and they will understand it, but the English speakers won't, which is, it's a little poem that I was taught by my teacher, which is Tian Bu Pa, Di Bu Pa, Zhou Pa Yang Gui Zi, Shua Guan Hua. And yes, I do know what it means. And so I understand my limitations with the Chinese language, and maybe 50 years ago I pronounced the words of that little poem correctly, more correctly than I do now. But in any case, I've been to China 3 times now, and since 1985, I've been to China 3 times, and they were wondrous experiences for me, and it makes a big difference to see people in their own living environment, and to know that we can now be friends and we can learn from one another. That's a terrific thing. And so anyway, okay, so So we have to have an alchemical vessel, and then we can integrate the archetypal spiritual energies into our sociocultural context. So I will tell the English speakers what my poem means, just so that they have a sense of it. So Tianbu Pa means don't fear heaven. Dibu Pa, don't fear earth or hell. And Jopa Yangwei Tzu means only fear foreign devils, foreigners, only fear foreign devils. Shuaguanhua means who speak Mandarin. And so maybe all of us are integrating, over the last 200 years, especially foreigners have come into China. And when that was first happening, maybe it was the foreigners were always quite dangerous and quite untrustworthy. And so a foreigner who could speak the language would be someone who was very suspicious. But now that you can interact with foreigners without those kinds of risks, then maybe we're not quite so bad. We may be different, but we're not devils anymore. and so that's an integration process of change that's been occurring over 200 years. And so that's why that makes sense. And so the powerful energies that are released when we talk to one another and exchange ideas are getting integrated into our world. And as we now have the internet, and that was quite a shock from a cultural perspective, because it meant that that so many, literally millions and millions of ideas have to all be integrated at the same time. And so we all feel a certain amount of chaos in our bodies. And so because we don't know which way to look, because everybody's got an idea and everybody's shouting at one another, and who's got the right idea and who's got the wrong idea. Well, that's going to have to be worked out and integrated into global society, because in the end, we're all in the same leaky lifeboat, namely the Earth. And so if we don't, as a species, work out how to keep that lifeboat from sinking, then there isn't going to be any human consciousness anymore anywhere in the universe, because we don't know of any other human consciousness. And so we're in this moment of chaos, and we have to learn to live and work with one another so that we can have the best conglomeration of the human species overall. And that will take some hundreds of years, maybe thousands, before we work out all those things. As long as we go to a religion that says, oh, all those other religions are bad and we have to kill all those people, God wants us to kill all those people, well, then we as human beings are not going to be able to integrate to the point where we can all live on the same planet. But if instead of fighting with one another, we can all look at one another and say, wow, what ideas are good, then then we can become something else. And so one of the ideas from religion from the East is the idea of meditation. And so the session that we did last night with Melissa Townsend, in which we were talking about her paintings about the Yoga Sutras, might be quite interesting to you, because the first painting, the Yoga Sutras, there are 195 verses, and they take one through the steps of yoga. And so the very first image that Melissa Townsend painted was a painting of milk spilled on a table. Okay, and what that image and the verse is, you know, these sutras are about yoga. Okay, and so what is yoga about? It's about the ability to step back from the chaos of life. Okay, so spilled milk, you know, things happen in your house all the time, and things happen around the world all the time. And so there's chaos, and yoga is about the ability to separate your mind away from that chaos and find tranquility within yourself. And so that first image already makes so much sense in terms of having a vision of what we have to learn to do in order to be able to talk to one another. We have to find a tranquil way of dealing with one another, because we've been trying the wars for time immemorial. I mean, as long as there have been human beings, there have been wars. But now we know that we found the limits of the earth. Okay, when humans were going out into the earth and populating it, everybody was fighting over territory, and that was quite natural. But now we have to realize that, oh, by the way, this territory is one place. It's a planet in the middle of the universe hanging there by itself. And this is the only place we can go. For the next tens of thousands of years, our species is only going to be in this one place. Maybe we might be able to populate Mars, and maybe in 1,000 years we might populate a moon of Jupiter or something like that. Who knows? But it's going to take a very long time. And so during that process of taking our consciousness out into the universe, we're going to have to be able to deal with one another. And so that's what this is about. And so understanding that this process of meditation, which appears in Buddhism, Jainism, Hinduism, you name it, in the East, that might be a good thing for Westerners. And of course, there are many Westerners who have adopted it, who have integrated it, knowing that you can live a happier life if, in the midst of chaos, you can step back and be in communication with your own self and with your own consciousness. And that can lead to tranquility. So that's a good idea that is from the East, and it's one that is in the process of being integrated into the collective in the West. I mean, just what I've been saying in the last 15 minutes is an example of it being integrated, because I'm explaining to the listeners of this video, both live and on playback, that this is what it's about. And this is what this section of this essay is about. That we we have all this chaos in the world, and we as individuals each have to go back and look at ourselves and see what we can offer to make it a better world. So, Dr. Jung, at the end of his life, had a book called Man and His Symbols written. He wrote a part of it, and it was for the layman, for an average person. And there's one paragraph in it that is really important, and it's in his own essay, which he wrote. And in the hardbound version, it's on page 101 of the book. And here's what he says. As any change must begin somewhere, it is the single individual who will experience it and carry it through. The change must indeed begin with an individual. It might be any one of us. Nobody can afford to look around and to wait for somebody else to do what he is loath to do himself. But since nobody seems to know what to do, it might be worthwhile for each of us to ask himself whether by any chance his or her unconscious may know something that will help us. Certainly the conscious mind seems unable to do anything useful in this respect. Man today is painfully aware of the fact that neither his great religions nor his various philosophies seem to provide him with those powerful animating ideas that would give him the security he needs in the face of the present condition of the world, which is chaos. So, basically what Dr. Jung is saying in that paragraph is each of us needs to meditate, and oh, by the way, maybe we'll get an idea. And this YouTube channel and this very discussion that I'm providing to you now is exactly for that purpose. In other words, I examined myself and my own experiences, and I realized that if I made this available to others around the world, and fortunately now I can reach others around the world. If I did that, then there would be more and more integration of these ideas into the world. And so that's why I created this YouTube channel, and we have over 1,100 videos that are possible to look at on this YouTube channel. And it's why even in countries where you may not be able to look at YouTube, but you can look at Zoom, and therefore you can at least hear the message live. That's why I'm doing this particular session at 8 o'clock in the morning, my time. I mean, I just got off another session at 1:30 in the morning, so it's a bit of a stretch to get up at 8 and also give a session. But because it reaches a different audience, it makes sense to me to give a live session at this hour so that others who couldn't otherwise hear the message can hear it. And so that's why I'm doing it. Okay, so anyway, let's see if we can finish one paragraph at least in this essay. So anyway, going back to the alchemist vessel, the vessel is your family, or it's your religion, or it's your workplace maybe, or it can be your city or your county, whatever it is. You need that to bring these energies into and integrate them into your life. And how did they change your life? I don't know, but I know that I have worked with Dr. Jung's work for the last 33 years, And as a result of that fact, my life is better. I am better able to cope with myself and the changes that have come in my life. And so I wanted to share that with others. And so this is the vessel that I created. This YouTube channel and this Zoom is a vessel in which I can help integrate these ideas into society. That's exactly what I'm doing. So Dr. Arzt goes on, if the individual or society denies these energies the chance for expression, they will turn to confusion, destruction, and violence. So if we don't accept the energies that need to be accepted, then things are destructive again. And so it seems to me that the energy that we most need to bring into society and accept as a necessity in society is the idea that we do live in an alchemical vessel. It's called the earth, and we only have one. There's no alternative. And so we really have to understand how we can integrate all the differences that we have in the world. And obviously there are millions of them, but we have to be able to integrate all of those differences into our society so our human species can continue in an appropriate manner. So that's that idea. So then he says these words in Latin, Mercurius duplex. And so he's referring to the spirit coming up. Mercurius is a reference to Mercury or Hermes in Greek mythology, who was the god who went to the underworld, mainly the unconscious, and brought new ideas up. So Mercury is duplex. In other words, there are two sides. And so if you bring up something from the unconscious, it could have a bad side to it also. And so in the Bible, John reports in the first letter of John, 1 John 4:1, chapter 4, verse 1, Jesus says, examine the spirits, whether they be of God or not. In other words, the spirit coming up from the deep unconscious is twofold. It's one side is good and the other side is evil. That's duality in Buddhism. And so you have to examine those spirits. You have to examine all the ideas that come into your mind and decide which is the one, which is the side that you want to manifest into the world. If you manifest bad things, the results of that are going to be bad. That's karma. and so if you manifest good things, the results of that will be good. And, these are very complex things with lots of inputs. So you don't always, karma doesn't work instantly necessarily. And there are many aspects of it at many different levels. But ultimately, whether you have a good life, a successful life, or a bad and painful life, depends on whether you decide for the good more frequently than not. Okay, so he says, Mercurius duplex. It was alchemy that found the adequate expression for this, good with the good and bad with the bad. For the time being, though, it remains a mystery how the oversaturated overregulated societies of the West, run by disoriented and unimaginative guardians of the status quo in politics, media, business, should approach this monumental challenge. Okay, so the point is, how do we deal with this fact that whoever is in power wants to keep power, and they are going to try to push back forces that that don't go their way? We see that very dramatically in American politics right now, where the people who have power want to keep power. And so he's pointing out that it's a mystery how the oversaturated means, okay, when I was a kid, we only had news half an hour a day, but now we have news 7 by 24 by 365. We have it all the time. And so that's oversaturated. Overaged might be there are too many old guys like me who are trying to keep structures the way they were when we were young. And overregulated is the idea that we're holding back the spirit. We hold back the spirit in certain ways. And if you hold it back too much, you make something small. So an example is a bonsai tree in Japan. A bonsai tree, if you keep cutting it back, you can have an oak tree, and bonsai trees are actual trees. So you can have an oak tree or a pine tree or whatever, but by cutting it back, as it develops very small. And so it's quite possible to have a oak bonsai tree that is this big, okay? And so that's the point of overregulation of society, and it's a perfect metaphor for what we're talking about here, where if we cut everybody off, then we're going to get something small instead of something big and unruly. And so we have to balance the ideas of the regulation, the snipping the roots and branches back, and we have to balance that against an oak tree that might grow to be 50 or 60 feet high and might fall on your house. And so there's a balance there. And so we have to have imagination to make change. And so that's true in politics. What he's saying here is it's true in politics, media, and business. And it's a monumental challenge. For example, I changed a whole industry by moving the workload of typing what doctors say in hospitals, we call it medical transcription, moving that work from the United States to India. Now, when I first expressed that idea to someone that was working in a hospital in the US, they thought I was talking about Mars. I mean, they had never thought about India for anything involving their hospital in the United States. And the idea that we could get this work done in India was just a totally foreign idea to them. But over time, by creating the communications methods and by training people in India to be medical transcriptionists, we were able to do that. So I started with an idea on my back porch, and 7 years later, that idea had manifested into a business that provided employment for 6,000 people in my company and another 25,000 people in India. And so that's the type of thing where we have to think outside the box and figure out how we're going to integrate these ideas into our society. And, you know, politicians might say, oh, well, that was terrible that you took those jobs away from Americans and moved them to India. But the problem was that at that time, that medical transcriptionists were getting older and older in the United States, and nobody was taking up that work because it's difficult work, and the people who had been doing it as a livelihood were getting older and older and leaving the industry. So when I used to put advertisements for American medical transcriptions in the newspaper, I would not get any response from it. And so we literally were forced by the aging of that community to move that work to another place where people were very happy to receive the work. And so that's the kind of change that we have to make. So you could think of these directors of medical records as guardians of the status quo. They couldn't think it was a good idea to have the work typed on the other side of the world. They couldn't imagine that. But the fact is, that is what needed to happen and had to happen. And so it's a monumental challenge to get that kind of change, which is going on. So now, in the last 50 years since I studied Chinese, now there's no real probability that the US and China would be at war with one another, because in the last 50 years, we've now moved our production, the American production of products, including boots, let's say, to China. And so that has given work to Chinese, and it's given less expensive products to Americans. So we're both dependent upon it. And so, whereas before we were just global competitors on a grand scale, now we're interdependent and we need to work together. And so the whole idea of having militaries against one another, yes, we have differences of opinion about certain aspects of the world, but those need to be worked out in a peaceful manner, not in a confrontational manner. And so that's the challenge, and that's just one example of millions of examples that I'm sure we could all think about. And so so then Dr. Arzt says we are devoid of any vision for the future. And so I think, and so the problem is, as the internet is developed and opened up all these containers so that everything is sloshing back, all ideas are sloshing around the world, we don't have a, Dr. Arzt said we don't have a vision for the future, but I have a vision for the future now, which is to understand what the processes are. And the processes, very simply, are the processes that I described, which are that we have to listen to one another and adopt all the ideas that we think are good and throw away the bad ideas. That's a process. It's a process that went ahead in a relatively small container over the last 400 years, in the sense that The United States was that container. The country itself was that container. And we were already doing what the internet has done for the world. We were already doing it in the US. So we had clashing ideas, good ideas were adopted, bad ideas were thrown out. And the result of that tempering has been that the United States became stronger economically and militarily in the world. But now, because these ideas can come from everywhere, now it's a process for the whole world where, we have to keep looking around and finding the good ideas, the good ideas of what we should do next in every society, and we have to throw away the bad ideas. That's the process of developing the future and understanding how ultimately humanity will be basically one thing that can live together. It doesn't mean that we're going to give up our cultural history, but it also means that we can accept that somebody else might have a different cultural history, and we can live with that. That doesn't spoil the fact that we as human beings can live together on the leaky lifeboat that we live on, the earth. And so the process has been vastly accelerated since the beginning of the commercial internet, so that now all these ideas are coming together and they're crashing together, and it seems like chaos, but ultimately that chaos leads to this result, and it's an inevitable result, because inevitably the good ideas get accepted and the bad ideas get thrown away, no matter what you may think. And so it's a process that takes time. It does take time, but it's happening. And so there is a vision for the future. That's my vision, that now, whether we like it or not, we have to face the fact that we have to look at ideas from wherever they come up in the world. And as we do that, then we're going to achieve this balance, this alchemist vessel, which is going to be the whole world. We'll have differences a bit all over the world, but we'll have a general consensus of what's the right way to live. Okay, so going on. So then Dr. Arzt quotes the poet William Butler Yeats. He says, "The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity." And that was the attitude that was going on in Jung's day. And so so now we can have some conviction. Now we know this is the process. The process is that we have to draw from the good and reject the bad. It's as simple as that. And that happens inevitably, because even if some bad ideas get presented and maybe they control a certain part of the country, the earth in certain countries or whatever for 50 years or 100 years, they ultimately get rejected. And so we can say that well, I'm going to avoid that, but the point is that we can find things that are good and what we can do. For example, I urge anyone that's listening to this to follow my example and teach something that you believe in and do it on the internet so people can hear it all over the world. Okay, that's an example that I'm offering here on this YouTube channel. And so I urge you to steal my idea. Even if you want to talk about Dr. Jung's work, fine, because I believe that Dr. Jung had terrific ideas. Not everything was perfectly golden. Some of them were leaden, but we don't have to teach those. We can just teach the ones that were good. And I heard a pastor that I like on the internet say that Dr. Jung was not a perfect man. He was not a perfect Christian. And, the fact is he wasn't. I mean, for most people's point of view, he basically lived in a menage a trois for 40 years. In other words, he had a wife and his mistress, and the wife and mistress got along with one another. And Tony Wolff came over to the family home, the Jungian family home, every Sunday and had dinner with them. And, that was certainly quite controversial in those days. And even these days, such a thing is almost unheard of. And so he wasn't a perfect Christian, but you don't have to live your life the way he lived his life to understand his ideas and what came from his psyche and his study and his profession. And and so that pastor said, well, he wasn't a perfect Christian. And I had to ask him, do you know one? I don't know. Maybe not. Thank you, Colleen, for your comment on YouTube. So anyway, let's see if we can get to the end of this paragraph. So the last sentence is, meanwhile, much would be gained if the planetary turbulences of postmodernity could be interpreted as a pregnant phase of initiation, as a rite of passage. So what Dr. Arzt is saying is that, yes, we have chaos. And so just imagine what it means when an embryo is created in a woman's body, and she's developing over a 9-month period, an extremely complicated creature. All human beings are extremely complicated. And so it's something like that. In other words, in the gestation of a human being in the womb, it is practically chaos. From 2 cells which join together, a sperm and an egg, come everything that we are. And they already contain that conjunction, that embryo, even when it's only 2 cells. At the very first instant when the egg is fertilized, those 2 cells already contain everything that makes us what we are. Just imagine. And so the creation process of unfolding a human being is an incredibly complex issue in every being, okay, in every creature. And so we need to think of this time, which is a time of chaos, as something like that. It's, the future can be known, and it will be known eventually. And the structure of humanity as a species will be known eventually. And so 10,000 years from now, the human beings of that day will think that we are so archaic, but we, in the position we are perhaps, as to those 10,000 years from now, human beings, which is only a blink of time, um, we're like a fetus that's a week old right now. And we have chaos going on inside of our being as that fetus, where we have to create a brain, a heart, two lungs, and all the other, our intestines, and all the other features of being a human being. And we haven't done it yet. And how's it getting done? And nobody knows, and no one cell in the human being actually knows consciously what that will be, um, but nonetheless it develops inexorably. And so um, that's the phase that we're in. And so it's a kind of initiation for us into the way things will be in the future. So um, Dr. Young and Dr. Arzt were talking about the way of what is to come, and and searching for soul under postmodern conditions. So the way of what is to come is that there are going to be clashes, arguments, disputes, whatever, and they're going to be at every level, from the family to the country level. But each time we have to have the wisdom to decide what is good and what is bad. And uh, hopefully we mostly decide for the good. And um, and that will manifest a better world for us over time. So the way of what is to come is these clashes, and the way that we can understand what we individually can offer is by listening to ourselves. Because, as I said earlier, Dr. Jung said that, everything has to come from an individual. There's, nobody's got the answer. And so each individual must present what they can present. And so this YouTube channel and these talks that I'm giving are what I think will help. I could be wrong. Fair enough. I could be wrong, but if I'm more right than wrong, maybe you will get an idea that you want to spread around the world, and um, and ultimately we will all get smarter as a result of that. That's the idea. And so I think I'll stop there. it's that was one paragraph of Dr. Arst's essay, but it contained a lot of stuff. So my friends that are on the YouTube, or I'm sorry, on the Zoom chat right now, um, you correctly observe that these are difficult ideas. They're very deep. And so I've managed to spend an hour and a half talking about only about 15 lines of text. So I do agree that it's very deep and very complicated. And so I hope this has been helpful today. I'm going to terminate this session at this point. Um, but if anybody has a question, now would be the time to ask it or comment. Uh, and it's not necessary that you do. I do understand that some of the participants on Zoom might want to maintain their anonymity. And so please do not say anything if you don't want to. But if anybody does, it doesn't seem that's the case. So I'm going to terminate the session today, and I will begin again at 8 a.m. next Sunday. I hope this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you for coming today.